Welcome to your Health Facts. Today we're going to be digging into this question about the healthiest bread. And you might be surprised to hear that your assumptions about what is healthy bread
All right.
could be totally wrong.
Yeah. We see labels like low carb or high fiber or even organic.
Right.
And we just kind of assume, oh, great, healthy choice. But is it really?
Right.
Modern bread production has really strayed quite far from the simple, ancient roots of the staple food.
Yeah.
To illustrate this point, let's consider Switzerland.
Okay.
The Swiss eat bread all the time, breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Wow.
Yet they have incredibly low rates of prediabetes compared to the U.S.
Interesting.
One key factor is the quality and type of bread they consume.
Okay.
Swiss bread is often dense, packed with nuts and seeds, and made with predominantly whole grains. It's a far cry from the soft, fluffy, highly processed loaves that we see in a lot of supermarkets.
Yeah, for sure. So how can we find the healthiest bread?
Look for bread that passes the poke test.
Poke test.
If it's rock hard and doesn't easily squish, that's a good sign. The ingredient list should be short and recognizable.
Okay. So, and you mentioned nuts and seeds.
Exactly. Nuts and seeds add valuable fiber protein and healthy fats.
Okay.
Plus, they make the bread more filling and satisfying, so you're less likely to overeat.
Yeah.
It sounds like we need to rethink our relationship with bread.
I think so.
Okay.
Okay, so let's get into it.
Okay.
Let's dive into the most fundamental definition of bread.
Okay.
Flour, water, yeast.
Yeah.
You combine flour and water,
Yeah.
you leave it exposed, it becomes like a solid, unsquishable mass.
Right.
So when was the last time you had a bread made with just one grain or just 3 ingredients?
Yeah.
It's interesting. People who are on gluten-free diets often consume bread with multiple grains.
Right.
And ironically, that can be metabolically more detrimental than just having simple whole grain baked bread.
Yeah, and bread has an extensive history, 14,500 years.
Wow.
So it's a very ancient food.
Wow, that's crazy.
People who are health conscious might look for low-carb, high-fiber bread.
Right.
But the ingredients in these breads are quite far from the original recipe.
Yeah.
It's kind of like engineered food.
Right.
It's not the simplicity of bread making.
Yeah, going back to the Swiss example, bread is a huge part of their culture.
Yes.
They have it all day long, sometimes up to 5 meals a day.
Wow.
And you know what?
What?
Only about 5% of the Swiss population have prediabetes.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Right. But here in the United States, it's 1 in 3 Americans.
Wow.
1 in 3 Americans has prediabetes. Why is that?
Wow.
Because we have all this convenient engineered food and a very sedentary lifestyle.
Right.
Our quality of food and our physical activity has not kept pace with our technology.
Exactly.
Right.
We've consistently sought ways to compromise food quality and reduce movement over time.
Right.
The Swiss, however, are a very longevity-focused nation.
Yeah.
They're in the top 5 longest living countries in the world, and their supermarket bread is almost as good as bakery bread.
Wow.
There are lots of fresh loaves available.
So both supermarkets and bakeries have lots of loaves of bread,
Yes.
showing how much bread is part of their culture.
Right.
And these are not small loaves either. They're pretty big,
They can be very big.
freshly baked, available all over the place.
Wow.
And what's really interesting about Swiss bread is what's in it.
Okay.
So you can find bread that has higher fiber than carbs.
Wow.
And it's not from fiber powder. It's from nuts and seeds.
So a lot of their breads have nuts and seeds either sprinkled on top or folded into the dough.
Yeah.
And that adds a lot of those nutritional benefits and helps with metabolic health.
Okay, so when you're picking bread, there's 3 things that are important.
Okay.
First, do the poke test
Right.
to see how dense it is, how much it squishes.
Yeah.
Second, look at the ingredient list.
Okay.
You want a short list of ingredients that you recognize.
Yeah.
Don't get a bread that's got a whole bunch of stuff that you don't even know what it is. And third, look for a bread that's got nuts and seeds in it and not just 2%.
Right.
You want a significant amount of nuts and seeds.
Let's break down each of these a little bit further, starting with the poke test.
Okay?
What does that tell us about the quality of the bread?
Okay, so traditional bread, as we said, flour, water, yeast.
Yeah.
If you let it sit, it hardens.
Right.
So if it's squishy, there's something else in there.
Right.
Right. If it bounces back after you poke it, that means it's got a lot of starch.
Right.
It's not a lot of whole grain.
Hmm.
So let's look at some examples.
Okay.
So this bread, for example,
Yeah.
there's minimal squish and there's a slight bounce back.
Okay.
This bread doesn't bounce back at all.
Wow.
So that would suggest it's more dense and more whole grain.
This one has a little bit of bounce back, but not as much as the first one.
Okay.
This Texas toast here, which is pre-sliced, if I squeeze it, it kind of bounces back, whereas this one doesn't. So, you can't always take the bread out of the package to look at it,
All right.
but you can kind of squeeze it to get a sense of whether the ingredients are good or not.
Yeah, this one's frozen, and it's not sliced, so it's hard to squeeze it. But it feels pretty solid, so that's a good sign.
Right.
This one fails the squish test.
Yeah.
Look at this Swiss bread, how it does not squish.
Wow.
It's very dense. So the takeaway is that if the bread is made with higher quality, more intact grains, it's not going to squish as much.
Right.
Okay, now let's look at the ingredient list.
Okay.
So this bread, the first ingredient is enriched flour, which means it's not whole grain. So that's why it squishes, because it's basically starch, like cornstarch.
So the flour is enriched with some vitamins.
Okay.
Then we have water, sugar, butter, and eggs as the main ingredients. And then a whole bunch of other stuff that makes up less than 2% each, like sodium silicoaluminate potato flour yeast, sorbitan monostearate, ascorbic acid, added gluten datum, calcium silicate, sodium sterol, lactylate, calcium sulfate, ammonium sulfate, wheat starch, and enzymes.
Okay.
Does that sound like real bread?
Let's compare that to this one.
Okay.
Ingredients: organic whole wheat flour, water, organic vital wheat, gluten, organic sugar enzyme, wheat bran yeast, organic honey, organic oat fiber, organic molasses, organic expeller pressed canola oil, sea salt, organic distilled vinegar, microbial enzyme, organic guar gum, and ascorbic acid. So basically wheat.
This one is organic unbleached enriched flour. Kind of similar to the Hawaiian rolls, except it's organic.
Right.
Organic wheat flour and some vitamins, water, sea salt, yeast, and organic malted barley flour.
Okay.
So it's getting closer to the definition of bread, but it's still starch and not whole grain.
And this is Ezekiel bread. Organic sprouted wheat filtered water, organic sprouted barley, organic sprouted millet, organic malted barley, organic sprouted lentils, organic sprouted soybeans, organic sprouted spelt yeast, organic wheat gluten, and sea salt.
So there's a lot more ingredients, but it seems like they're all whole foods,
Right.
except maybe the wheat gluten. But that's more similar to the Swiss bread, which is using simple ingredients,
Right.
more like the original definition of bread.
Okay, so why do we want whole grain bread or sprouted grain bread?
Right.
And preferably organic.
Okay.
The goal is to consume the whole grain intact.
Right.
And that means the bran and the germ are in their original matrix that surrounds the starch. And this protects your body from a sugar spike.
Now, if you remove the bran and the germ, you basically have flour, which has a longer shelf life because it's starch. You've taken out all the fat and the fiber. You're left with starch. And starch spikes your blood sugar more than table sugar does. However, there are ways to mitigate blood sugar spikes when you eat starch.
Okay.
One way is to refrigerate or freeze the bread. This causes something called retrogradation,
Okay.
which basically converts the sugar starches into resistant starch.
Got it.
Resistant starch your body can't digest, but it's good food for your gut bacteria.
Okay.
So it acts like a fiber.
Interesting.
If you heat it up, it still retains most of the resistant starch.
So another thing that helps mitigate blood sugar spikes is exercise.
Right.
What pro athletes often do is they work out after they eat these kinds of breads.
Exactly.
And that helps to regulate their blood sugar.
But if your goal is health and nutrition,
Right.
you need to diversify your diet.
Okay.
The American diet is very focused on single ingredient foods.
Right.
And that's really contributing to a lot of our metabolic dysfunction. We need a diversity of foods
Okay.
because no one ingredient can provide everything we need.
If you're eating too much wheat, particularly in bakery goods, that's a problem.
You're accumulating the toxins from the wheat.
Right.
And you're not getting the diversity of micronutrients.
When you load bread up with sugar,
Right.
it's not just a simple starch raising your blood sugar. It's simple sugars which are fluctuating your blood sugar.
Whether it's table sugar or agave or honey,
Right. Yeah.
it's all sugar and it's all going to raise your blood sugar.
These things are not actually in bread.
Right.
They're added to change the texture and the taste.
And then you end up with a product that's more like cake than bread.
Right.
So if you want cake, eat cake. Don't pretend it's bread.
And what's even worse than simple sugars and starches is oils.
Right.
Even if it's high-quality olive oil or other vegetable oils, they add it to change the texture.
Right.
but your body has a hard time metabolizing sugar and oils at the same time.
You can't do both.
Right.
One gets in the way of the other.
Well, if you're eating too much of this stuff with sugar and oil,
Mm.
it messes up your metabolism.
You start storing fat.
Right.
And it's that combination of fat and carbs that drives insulin resistance,
Hmm.
which then leads to fat storage.
Right.
And insulin resistance also increases your risk of fatty liver and obesity.
So you can be thin on the outside,
Right.
but fat on the inside.
Asians actually tend to have a higher body fat percentage at the same BMI
Interesting.
compared to people of European or African descent,
Mm.
especially in terms of their abdominal fat distribution.
So even if they have a lower BMI,
Right.
they might have more visceral fat.
Which leads to something called TOFI.
TOFI.
Thin on the outside, fat on the inside.
Wow.
So they might look lean or have normal body weight, even low BMI, but they have an unhealthy amount of visceral fat.
And this is not just about appearance.
Right.
It's a health risk.
Exactly.
TOFI increases your risk of...
All sorts of metabolic issues.
Right.
Insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver, high blood pressure, high cholesterol. And this is all despite looking healthy on the outside.
Mm.
Visceral fat is also strongly linked to heart disease and atherosclerosis,
Mm.
which is a hardening of the arteries,
Right.
which then increases your risk of heart attack and stroke.
Interesting.
Unlike subcutaneous fat, which is the fat you see like love handles or whatever,
Right.
visceral fat you can't see. It's surrounding your internal organs like your liver, pancreas, and intestines.
Yeah, if you're ever in an abdominal surgery, you can see it very clearly.
It's everywhere.
Mm.
Makes it hard to stitch things up.
Yeah. And it's bad for your metabolism.
Visceral fat is metabolically active.
Hmm.
It produces inflammatory substances.
Right.
It messes with your immune function.
And unfortunately, Asian genetics kind of predispose people to TOFI.
They tend to store fat viscerally more than other ethnicities.
So it's in their genes to get TOFI.
Yeah, to some extent.
But their lifestyle choices, particularly what they eat,
Play a big role.
can either make it better or worse.
Ex-
So if you minimize the amount of highly refined starches and processed foods that are common in our modern diets, that will help.
Yeah, we've moved away from traditional whole food-based diets
Mm.
to these highly processed convenience foods.
Right?
And that's really driving this global rise in metabolic disease.
The ingredients we choose
Right.
have profound effects on our metabolic processes.
Everything from blood sugar regulation to
Right.
fat storage to
Yeah.
inflammation.
So by understanding the nuances of bread composition and how it impacts our health,
Right.
we can make better choices
Exactly.
that support long-term well-being.
It's not just about finding the lowest calorie or highest fiber bread.
Hmm.
It's about going back to the roots of this ancient food.
Right.
Embracing those simple yet powerful ingredients and
Great.
prioritizing whole food-based approaches to nutrition.
To learn more about nutrition and healthy living,
Yes.
you can subscribe to yourhealthfacts.com. So what have we done about this?
Well, we've introduced rice cakes, gluten-free rice bread, Asian rice tamales, rice noodles, rice crackers, rice mochi. These aren't traditional ancient Asian foods.
Right.
These are modern creations that are made with technology and processing,
Mhm.
and they've kind of snuck into Asian diets.
So if you don't eat white rice,
Mm,
you're probably not too worried about this.
right.
But the risk of getting beriberi from eating white rice has been mitigated by fortifying the rice with thiamine.
So basically, we've traded an acute life-threatening condition
Right.
for chronic metabolic diseases
Hmm.
from poor nutrition.
Right.
We've got fatty liver, diabetes, obesity, from eating empty calories from low-quality food.
Okay, so thiamine deficiency is still a thing today.
Right.
And those at highest risk are people who have compromised nutritional intake or absorption.
Right.
So this includes people who've had bariatric surgery, inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's or celiac disease,
Right.
short gut syndrome people on restrictive diets that limit carbohydrates.
For people with illness or trauma and people with alcohol addiction.
Right.
Now, these populations often exceed the minimum recommended amount of thiamine,
Right.
but that dose is not enough for their metabolic needs.
The RDA is woefully inadequate to support optimal health.
So we're not getting enough thiamine, even though we might be getting the minimum amount.
Right.
And thiamine is water soluble, meaning that if you have extra, you just pee it out.
So you need to consume more than the minimum
Right.
to make sure you have enough.
So don't just rely on the RDA for thiamine,
Hmm.
especially if you think you're deficient.
Right.
You need to correct it quickly with higher doses.
Right.
It's not uncommon to see 100 milligrams of thiamine given intravenously,
Wow.
at least once a day in a hospital setting.
Right.
Thiamine is essential for carbohydrate metabolism.
Hmm.
So the more carbs you eat,
Right.
the more thiamine you need.
Exactly.
And if you're eating carbs that haven't been fortified with thiamine,
Like candy bars or sugary drinks.
you're depleting your thiamine stores.
Right.
Instead of educating people
Yeah.
to seek out whole foods
Right.
that are rich in thiamine,
Right.
we've decided to fortify and engineer our food.
Hmm.
And it's not just in America.
Right.
It's all over the world.
Right. Thiamine fortification is very prevalent in processed grains globally.
Which tells us how important thiamine is for human health.
So if you're someone who's concerned about taking supplements or you're on a low-carb diet, really look into food history
Okay.
and how essential nutrients were discovered.
Right.
Because you'll see that just meeting the recommended minimum intake
Right.
may not be enough for what your body needs on a daily basis.
When I first went to China after I graduated college, I was amazed at how many people were physically active,
Wow.
like walking and cycling.
Right.
Everyone was lean. But when I went back in 2019, it had changed dramatically. The bicycles were gone, replaced by cars and mopeds.
Interesting.
Almost everyone was driving or riding a moped.
And what happened to their diabetes rates?
They skyrocketed. When you don't exercise,
Right.
you lose the most powerful metabolic organ
Right.
that protects your metabolism, your muscles.
Right. And people with TFI tend to have low muscle mass.
Exactly.
And Asians often don't exercise enough,
Right.
mainly because of the culture. There's a huge emphasis on academics, and they're not big on sun exposure. But daily exercise is essential for everyone, especially if you're eating bread,
Right.
even the healthier breads that we talked about earlier.
The average Swiss person walks 9,000 steps a day.
Wow.
Track your steps with the health app. If you're going to eat bread, try to get at least 9,000 steps.
So we have all these engineered foods
Right.
masquerading as bread
Right.
in the supermarket.
Right.
They're labeled as organic, keto, all-natural, plant-based, high-fiber multigrain. But millions of people are still experiencing metabolic decline at alarming rates.
Food is not like technology. It hasn't been constantly upgraded in quality.
Right.
We're being tricked by marketing into thinking that these ancient foods can be improved with modern engineering. Right. But history has shown us time and time again that this is not true.
You know, I used to love bread, but I've given up on it.
Really?
It's too hard to figure out the ingredients.
Yeah.
When I was younger, I thought bread was healthy. In college, I ate a bagel every single day.
I was a big bagel fan, too. When I went to visit my brother at Harvard, we went bagel hopping in Cambridge.
Wow.
I ate 3 full bagels that morning.
Wow.
From 3 different bagel shops.
What kind of bagels did you like?
Oh, I loved the chewy ones and the cinnamon raisin bagels.
Okay.
Those were so good.
Yeah, but those are not the healthiest bagels.
No, not really.
When I was younger, I was very active. So I could eat all these highly refined engineered carbs and not really gain weight. But as I got older and my career became more demanding and I became more sedentary,
Right.
decades of eating these high glycemic index foods caught up with me.
Right.
My metabolism slowed down.
Right.
I developed fatty liver, which led to insulin resistance,
Right.
which led to gestational diabetes during my first pregnancy.
Wow.
And I wasn't even clinically obese.
Well, part of that is Asian genetics.
Right.
Asians tend to store fat viscerally as opposed to subcutaneously, which is more common in other ethnicities.
Right.
So they tend to have a higher body fat percentage at the same BMI compared to people of European or African descent.
Okay.
And this is especially true for abdominal fat distribution.
So even if they have a lower BMI,
Right.
they might have more visceral fat.
Which contributes to TFI. I remember when I was a resident,
Okay.
there was this nurse. I thought she was pregnant
Really?
because her belly was so big. And after a few months, I asked her when she was due.
Oh, no.
Oops.
You don't want to ask people that.
No, you don't.
So 2FI is not just about how you look.
Right.
It's a health risk.
It increases your risk of all sorts of metabolic complications. Insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and all this while looking lean on the outside.
Unlike subcutaneous fat, which is the fat you can see,
Right.
like love handles,
Right.
visceral fat is hidden.
It's surrounding your internal organs.
And if you have abdominal surgery, You can see it.
It's right there.
Right.
It makes it difficult to suture.
Right.
It messes with your metabolism. It promotes inflammation. It impairs your immune function.
So while Asian genetics predispose people to 2FI,
Right.
lifestyle choices, particularly diet,
Play a big role.
right?
You need to minimize highly refined starches
Right.
and processed foods,
Right.
which are very common in our modern diets.
Oh, we've moved away from traditional whole food-based diets towards these highly processed, convenience-driven options.
Right.
And that has fueled this global rise in metabolic disease.
The ingredients that we choose to put into our bodies have profound effects on our metabolic processes.
Right.
Everything from blood sugar regulation to fat storage
Right.
to inflammation.
So by understanding the nuances of bread composition
Right.
and its impact on our health,
Right.
we can make informed decisions
Right.
that support our well-being.
The quest for the healthiest bread is not just about finding the lowest calorie or highest fiber option.
Right.
It's about rediscovering the essence of this ancient food, embracing its simple yet powerful ingredients, and prioritizing whole food-based approaches to nutrition.
We've really dug deep into bread, haven't we?
We have. We've looked at what bread's made of, how people have eaten bread over time, and how our modern diets are making us sick.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy to think about.
It is.
And, the Swiss example really shows us that eating good quality ingredients and using traditional methods can make a big difference in our health and how long we live.
It's a good reminder that those engineered foods that are everywhere these days,
Right.
they're not really food.
It's like we've forgotten about the simple, nourishing foods that kept people healthy for so long.
Yeah, we need to be careful about what we're putting in our bodies.
Right. We can't just trust the labels. We
Exactly.
have to read the ingredient lists carefully.
And choose bread. That's more like what bread used to be.
Simple ingredients.
Right, back to basics.
So remember the 3 things to look for.
The poke test,
The poke test.
the ingredient list,
Right.
and nuts and seeds.
Nuts and seeds.
Those are your keys to finding the healthiest bread.
And making good choices for your health and well-being.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of bread.
It has.
I hope everyone listening has learned a lot
Me too.
and that you'll use this information to make healthier choices in your own lives.
That's what it's all about.
And if you want to learn more about nutrition and healthy living, be sure to subscribe to yourhealthfacts.com.
Thanks for listening, everyone.